This is Lecture 4 for Week 12 of HOS 121 as we continue the discussion of older adulthood and end of life, now looking at grief and dying. Before we begin, I just wanted to mention there's a lot on grief and dying. It can be its own subject to itself, just like child development is often its own subject. You can take a course just about infant development, and you can take a course just about grief and dying. So we're just getting the tip of the iceberg here, just a couple of theories that look at the processes of grief and the processes of dying. But what we'll look at in this lecture is some ways how people cope with loss, discuss that a little bit, and then look at a theory of loss which relates very well to our theme around attachment, Parks-Bowlby attachment model of bereavement. And then we'll talk a little bit about how people deal with their own deaths, and a theory of dying coming from Elisabeth Kubler-Ross and her stages of dying. First, I just wanted to say that it's important to think about the big social context of death overall, the historical context, the cultural context, because we construct the social meaning of death as part of a culture. So what it means varies in terms of the historical period someone lives in, the cultural context. The social meanings that are attached to death change over time, and also by culture. And that's also true in terms of how people express grief and how they mourn. So if you think about even here in Australia, we would have, in the past, women probably and men would have been in a period of mourning. They would have worn black. They may not have gone out publicly for a period of time. They certainly wouldn't have married within a certain period of time. It would have been frowned upon. But things are different now in the present day, and in some ways the rules are less clear around these things. So the broader social context, if we think about Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, the historical time period in which we live, the broader macro culture that we live in, very much influences how we think about death and how people express grief. There's a lot of different words we use when we talk about loss. Bereavement is the condition of having lost someone, experienced a loss through death. Grief is about the emotional experience of losing someone, and mourning is how grief is expressed. So as I just mentioned, that may happen through the way people dress, their social interactions, and through, of course, their emotional, how they show their emotions publicly. So normal grief reactions, there's a range of grief reactions, and there's no way of expressing grief. There's no normal way. So various reactions include sorrow, sadness, denial, disbelief, guilt, anger, and also having a reaction, particularly being triggered around the times of certain anniversaries or important dates, like the birthday of a loved one, one's marriage anniversary, the date of the death, that can bring back those feelings of sadness and other feelings of grief. And the way that one copes with loss has to do with many different things that we've talked about in this subject, including things like personal resources, personality, how much one can handle change, how one deals with change, attachment style. So just like attachment style influences peer relationships, romantic relationships, it can relate also to how one deals with loss. And we'll talk a little bit more about attachment later in this lecture. The nature of the loss, and so there's a lot of evidence that the most painful loss for people is the loss of a child. And then following that would be the loss of a partner and a parent. And it's also whether the loss is unexpected or expected. That also influences the experience people have often with bereavement. And the context of the experience. Are people receiving support of other life stressors when they're experiencing and coping with their grief? The loss of one's partner or spouse is a difficult transition for most people. It brings up feelings of loneliness, particularly right around the time of bereavement and loss. And for people who are in later life, it can cause social isolation. People often don't know how to respond to the person who has lost someone, and so There can be a loss of social ties, and men may in particular experience this, where particularly if their partner is the one who's created and reached out more to others to try to encourage social relationships. And men can also face challenges related to household tasks, particularly if you think about the generations in the past, the way that they've divided household labor, and a male breadwinner means that if there's been that kind of division of labor in a family, in a partnership, men may really have to adjust around having to learn how to cook and maintain a house, and then women may have more financial types of issues. And some people choose to remarry, in part because of the social isolation that can come widowed. So there are various theories of how people cope with their grief at the loss of a loved one. But one that we'll look at, and that's particularly relevant for our subject, is the attachment model of bereavement, which was developed by Parks and builds on Bowlby's attachment theory. And the idea of this model is that the grieving adult is very much like the infant who experiences separation distress from the parent when they leave the room in the strange situation. That basically it's a reaction when you have a loss to being apart and separated from the loved one. And the idea is that humans have evolved to form attachment and to protest their loss. And that's what an infant does in a strange situation in their reactions, protest separation. And this is what people do when they are protesting the loss of a loved one. And it's an interesting theory for us to consider because we've seen the power of attachment looking at early childhood and infancy, and how the attachment relationship evolves with parents in the early childhood years, and then how attachment relationships influence peer relationships and friendships, and the types of attachment relationships people develop, how that internal working model influences their romantic relationships. And attachment is even important at the end of life when we think about how people respond to the loss of a loved one. So the attachment model of bereavement looks at some different reactions, and first acknowledges that many people have an experience of being in a daze after the initial loss, that people have an experience of unreality and disbelief, but there's powerful feelings underneath that state of numbness that people are maybe not quite ready to deal with. So the bad news hasn't completely sunk in because there's a sense of shock. And then there's an experience of yearning where emotional reactions do start to come on, and people may be weeping or in panic, unable to sleep. And it's really the important thing about this yearning experience is a pining for the lost loved one and a longing to be reunited. And that's an expression, according to this model, of separation distress that you see when a child is separated from their attachment figure. That's one of the 4 aspects of attachment that we've discussed, is separation distress, and wanting proximity to the attachment figure, but that's not possible. And so the stage around disorganization, or the experience of disorganization and despair, is this increasing recognition that proximity and being reunited is not possible. And so people can have a sense of depression, apathy, despair that comes at this stage, when there is not an opportunity for reunion. But eventually, most people will get to a reorganization stage where they can shift their energy and look at the possibility of building new attachments. So, for example, someone who's lost a partner may have a shift in their identity from a wife or husband to being a widow or a widower, and prepared to consider new relationships. So those are some thoughts around grief and loss, and now we're going to also talk about how people deal with their own deaths. So how people deal with their own deaths have a lot to do, first of all, with the cause of death. If it's a sudden cause, of course, people may not have time to prepare. But with diseases that are more chronic diseases, certain diseases, if they're longer term, give people time, versus a disease that may be more unpredictable in terms of its course. And the reading talks about the idea of death anxiety, so how people feel about death, and at any stage in the lifespan people can have this, particularly as, for children, before they understand death it's different, but as people begin to have a sense and understand death, people may have a feeling about death anxiety, a diffuse anxiety about death. But this relates also for older adults to Erikson's stage of integrity versus despair, and the strength that he talked about that comes from the struggle between integrity versus despair is the strength of wisdom, which is being able to face one's death, feeling good about the life that they've had. And another consideration for dealing with one's death is around preparing a final scenario, which is making one's wishes known about end of life in terms of what kinds of life lengthening interventions someone would want, hospice and pain interventions, that kind of thing. What people want in terms of living will and what they want in terms of their estate after their lives are done. As with theories about how people cope with the loss of a loved one, there are various theories about how people cope with the idea of their own death. The most famous of these would likely be Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's theory, which is described as a stage theory, but it's been criticized because dying is not stage-like, and the way that the course of an illness affects how people react to it. So again, the ups and downs, do you have a terminal phase for preparation or not? So these different reactions, they're better understood as reactions rather than stages, can overlap. They can unfold into different sequences. They don't go 1 through 5 neatly. And there are individual differences in experiencing a particular reaction, the duration of that reaction, and the intensity someone experiences of an emotion. So we'll have a look at these stages of dying, but again, I think they're better conceived of as reactions, keeping in mind that people will not go through them as a linear process, and people will have individual differences. So as we go through this list, keep in mind again that these are better understood as reactions rather than stages of dying. Again, there's really no evidence for a stage-like process of death, but these are the types of reactions that can be observed in people who are coping with an impending death. And so they include denial, so kind of a shock reaction, disbelief, no, it can't be, and even denying diagnosis, for example, believing it can't be right, or that the person can beat even very slight odds for a terminal illness. And this experience of denial can really be a coping mechanism to give people a little bit of space before preparing for the magnitude of the experience. And then anger is another reaction people may have, a sense of why me? And that can manifest as hostility towards doctors, towards the idea of God, and resentment. Why are others not facing this experience of death? So people may have an anger reaction. Bargaining can be another reaction people can have, looking for a way out. Bargaining, wanting a little bit more time, a little bit more space, with one's family. And that bargaining can be, again, with a sense of a higher power to have a little bit more time, for example. Depression can be another reaction, not being able to deny the reality of death, having feelings of sorrow and loss about death, and feelings of maybe guilt and shame, the things one regrets, things one won't be able to do. And then people may also get to a point where they have a reaction of acceptance, where they accept the inevitability of death and can face death with peace and some sense of detachment. And this really connects to the idea, again, from Erikson, of wisdom, of going through the struggle of integrity versus despair, and achieving wisdom to be able to face one's death, knowing that one is pleased with the life that one has lived and satisfied with it. Finally, I just wanted to point out, you may have noticed, a lot of these emotions would have a parallel between the two models of Kubler-Ross's stages of dying and the Parks and Bowlby attachment model of bereavement. This isn't in your reader, but it comes from the same original textbook. And so there can be reactions, the feeling of denial that a person may be experiencing when they learn about a terminal illness is similar to maybe to an experience of that people can feel when they're facing the death of a loved one. That anger, relates to that kind of yearning stage, and anger, guilt that people can experience when they're bereaved, and they very much want the person back. There's that reaction, attachment reaction, and that can be similar perhaps where that person is angry because they want the attachment of their own lives and the ideas that they've had about what they will be doing with their life. There can be a parallel with depression to that idea of a disorganization and despair that people may experience in loss when maybe the full weight really sets in and the pain of that. And then acceptance may relate to this sense of reorganization as people who have experienced a loss prepare for the next stage, much like someone who's accepted death may prepare for that experience. So there are some parallels in terms of the types of reactions that people may experience through grief and loss. So that brings us to the end of this lecture and this week, and also really to the lectures for the course. So we started in the prenatal period in infancy, went all the way to the end of life, particularly looking at our 3 models from the subject around social context and socialization, attachment and relationships, and self and identity. So that's all for now. Thanks.